Oh, today, very special episode. For the first time, we have a returning guest on the Grove, a member of the Grove, Celine King. She is a co-founder and CEO at a company called GreenIRR. That's GreenIRR. They do sustainable accounting for the trucking industry. She explains what they do a lot better than I could on this introduction. But what's exciting about Celine is that you'll see about 8 months ago, our first interview discussing how she got to the point that she's at with GreenIRR, her personal journey with entrepreneurship. And 8 months later, we're able to talk about all the significant change that has happened in her company since then, and a very different go-to-market approach and very different plan for scale than what was previously thought. So very interesting to get her perspective now. She's much more deeply embedded in the industry and drops a lot of very interesting industry knowledge. So very cool to be able to celebrate somebody's growth trajectory like that. So I'm looking forward to the next one with her in another however many months to celebrate her continued growth. Thank you, as always, to our sponsors, Clean Tech Growth Lab. If you're looking to grow in clean tech, they're the people to do it with. And the producers of this podcast, Craze and Friends. With that, I give you Celine. Oh, welcome to another episode of The Grove. It's a special day. We have one of the OGs of The Grove, Celine King. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
It has been such a crazy time for you since we did our last episode, and we caught up on a call recently. I have all these notes, things that you were talking about that have happened, and capture them on this episode is going to be great for everybody else. So for anyone that hasn't seen that last episode or somehow hasn't heard of you, you give a brief introduction of yourself and what you're building.
Yeah. My name's Celine King. I'm the CEO and founder of GreenIRR, and GreenIRR is a carbon accounting platform built specifically for Fortune 500 companies and the trucking fleets that they contract. So we essentially have a technology that connects to the only two primary data sources in trucking and logistics, which would be telematics and then fuel cards. So that hardware component that exists inside of every vehicle, and then credit cards that are used by drivers. So we collect real-time vehicle performance data, we standardize it, and then we provide performance reporting both through a sustainability lens, an efficiency lens, and we're able to essentially provide visibility that didn't exist before across contracted carrier networks.
And just like last time, there's a lot in that I don't understand. So I'm excited to walk through all of this because there's a lot of things about a lot of similar themes around slow-moving industries, hard-to-abate industries, like regulation, data transparency, long sales cycles, these types of things. But as it relates to trucking specifically, you're really gonna teach me today. So before we get into the first point of questions, though, if we could just revisit one of my favorite questions, which is, did you always want to be a founder? Did you always see yourself as an entrepreneur, or did something happen at some point where you said, this is what I want to do for my life?
I never envisioned myself being a founder. It felt like I didn't have a choice once the idea and the genesis of GreenIRR became more clear to me. I always knew I wanted to have an environmental impact, positive environmental impact. And I always assumed that I was going to be helping someone else execute their own vision until I realized that the existing pathways of doing that didn't exactly feel true for me. And so once I started to ideate on the best vehicle for impact within the climate space, which is GreenIRR, I became obsessed, and I became married to the idea and married to the execution of bringing that idea to fruition. And truly, to this day, believe that the best impact that you can drive is through bringing disruptive technologies to legacy industries. And so that being said, love being in control of my own destiny and my own impact.
How long has it been, would you say, since
3 years?
you started this journey? 3 years?
3 years commercially, 4 years from ideation to present day.
For your personal journey, what has changed over that time?
That's a great question. I think two things. My personal growth And my perspective has like completely flipped on its head, where I think I had a misconception of what it meant to build something from scratch, the challenges that come with it, and that it is much more of a mental journey than it is a material journey, which is something that we talked about on our last podcast. And then I would say something else that has changed is the market, the regulatory environment, the industry, the external pressures that we're building within are completely different from when we first started.
Mm-hmm. Well, so we did get into a lot of it, the personal journey last time.
Yes.
So for anybody that's curious, I would say watch that episode, because right now we're going to get into the thick of all this stuff that you've learned about the industry. And the first thing that I'm curious about is really the foundation for why GreenIRR is building in this space. And it's the relationship between shippers and carriers and everything that happens here. So I'm not familiar with this sector. Could you just give a foundational understanding of what is a shipper, what is a carrier, how do they interact?
Yes. So a shipper is any company with a supply chain. So you could think of Mars, you could think of Estee Lauder, Saint-Gobain, Nestle, any commodity, any product, any intermediary that goes in a product that needs to be moved from point A to point B and is part of an existing supply chain. That supply chain belongs to what we would consider a shipper. For us, we tend to gravitate towards global supply chains, typically larger supply chains that are more complex or sophisticated. Those tend to exist within the Fortune 500 companies or larger private companies. And carriers are trucking companies. They're fleets that are contracted, oftentimes by those shippers to move their freight. Or you also have instances where there's private fleets, that would be like a Walmart, where the vehicles are owned or operated by the company. So the simplest way to distill it is shippers are companies that have a supply chain, carriers are trucking companies.
And it's only for the biggest companies where they handle both.
It's not uncommon that Walmart, for example, has their own contracted network in addition to their private fleet.
Okay. So what is happening then because I think one of the easiest and lowest hanging fruit as far as sustainability or the conversation around carbon emissions are vehicles. And I mean, I guess the image that I have in my head of these of these trucks, like these 18-wheelers on the highway, is that they're gross. So what is the what is the environment around shippers and carriers and regulation and sustainability? Like how does all of that fit together?
So to paint the most accurate picture, trucking is extremely fragmented as an industry. So 95% of fleets operate 20 vehicles or less, which is staggering, right? There's 20 million carriers in the United States. 95% of them are smaller. They're owner operators or they're mom and pop shops.
Not that you'll know the answer to this, but how is that the case? How has there not been acquisition, consolidation?
I think if you just think about, well, there has been a really interesting, this also will context set is COVID, for example. There was such a large demand for the movement of goods because of what was happening in the world that a bunch of people entered the market that never had been in trucking. It was, one person, one truck.
Wow.
The rates were so high.
That's crazy.
And then COVID went away and the market started to right size itself, supply and demand shifted.
Got it.
And you were left with a lot of smaller owner operators, a lot of mom and pop shops. But I would say that trucking is an expensive business to be in. So to procure and to grow your fleet beyond 10 to 20 vehicles is extremely expensive unless you have like highly efficient operations and steady cash flow. And so I think that's just the nature of the industry.
Okay. So what has been the history of regulation for these companies?
Yeah. the trucking industry's relationship with environmental regulation is probably not great. And I think heading into commercialization, it wasn't something that I appreciated until I started talking to trucking owners and operators,
Got it.
where they are 100% valid in feeling frustration with either local, state, or federal regulations because they're so volatile, which is what we're experiencing right now. You're told to do one thing, you invest your capital in newer equipment, and then the regulation that required you to do so disappears, or it swings back the complete opposite way. So for us, the regulations that are the most relevant are emission disclosure regulations. And what's really interesting is they do not always impact the industry directly, but they always impact the trucking company's customer. So a lot of times the scope of these regulations are revenue driven. And because the trucking industry in general has a ton of smaller operators, those operators are not directly in scope, but the companies that they carry for are. And so
Wow.
that's really where we see this. It's a confusing dynamic for anyone to figure out. And then you add volatile regulatory changes. And a lot of times it just creates freeze because no one knows what's actually going to get put in place, what's going to continue on, what's real, what's not real. Yes, I would just also add that the two regulations that are the most important today are California SB 253. That means any company that makes over $1 billion in revenue or more and does business in the state of California, they have to report scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, scope 3 being the supply chain. And then CSRD, which is Europe's
Yeah.
regulation.
Okay. I did. There you go. I did have those. So this is, so SB 253 is California and CSRD is Europe.
Yeah, and you'll see more and more. The US federal regulation is non-existent. So
Right.
state level regulation has intensified. But in a way, I think it's been good for the industry.
Okay. So then it's interesting because there's this, there's increasing, I guess, in Europe and California and, other states, but
Yeah.
more as we go into the future. There's pressure to have clarity about emissions data.
Yeah.
And it is really difficult to have that clarity in general about that data. So, so that's what's frustrating about it. So it's, I guess, from my understanding, it's less about a shipper being like, oh, I care about being sustainable or I don't care about being sustainable, but it's more like I need clarity of data. And a consequence of having clarity of data is sustainability.
Yeah, I think two things. I think when the perspective is that I'm only doing this because it checks the box for compliance, it really deters progress because regulation promotes the bare minimum in terms of standards, where when you have market pressure, where, say, for example, a shipper has a net zero by 2030 goal and they're going to hit it whether there is regulation or not, that's when it can become a competitive differentiator for those fleets to demonstrate sustainable performance. I also think the story in transportation between sustainability and profitability has been told wrong, where in every other industry, sustainability has a trade-off, right? Until there's cost parity. In transportation, it is one-to-one. If you reduce your fuel consumption, you're reducing your emissions. Your pathway of getting there, I was going to say doesn't matter. Of course it does, but you can do it through upgrading equipment, which carriers do no matter what, because it makes them more efficient. You can do it through diversifying your fuel mix. You can do it through electrification, which is a more expensive pathway. But in that lens and that perspective, transportation's been obsessed with sustainability since the dawn of time. And what they lack is, to your point, the infrastructure and the data to prove their performance and their progress.
It's like you're reading my mind. These are notes I already had. So the from a carrier's perspective, sustainability equals profitability.
Yes.
That is a point that you'd made. Fleet electrification is something that you just touched on, something I have written down. So can you expand on that more? How is that happening now? Where is it going? What is the story around that?
Electrification.
Mm-hmm.
So, electrification is such an interesting topic because it originally came down as a mandate through CARB, through California. If you wanted to carry in the state, whether you were headquartered there as a fleet or not, there was pressure to electrify in a phased-in way through 2030. There still is something called the Clean Truck Act, Clean Truck Check through CARB, but fleets were not given the opportunity to choose whether they wanted to electrify or not. They were just told that if they didn't, they were going to lose the ability to carry in a particular state, which is pretty intense.
Mm-hmm.
There was the general feeling that the policymakers were not communicating with the industry that they were imposing policy on, which is true because anyone knows that the cost of an EV is more expensive. The infrastructure isn't there. The production of EVs is not sustainable for the volume of electric vehicles that they were
Sure.
requiring to enter the industry.
Oh, interesting.
And so that's another great example of a disconnect between environmental policy and an industry that is just a necessity to moving goods across the economy. And so that was a massive, massive frustration with California. Then the US sort of deregulated itself. That policy and pressure eased up. Electrification was entirely rejected. And then just in the past few months, we've seen this crazy swing back where almost every fleet that GreenIRR has talked to has plans to electrify. They found use cases where it's, at cost parity or more profitable for them, or they want to incorporate it as part of their brand because they can charge a higher rate for moving goods for a particular customer on dedicated EV vehicles.
Wow. Really?
And that's a green premium. Yeah.
Cool. Wow. Well, first of all, that's encouraging.
Yes.
Second, all the conversation I've had around green premiums is that it was a COVID thing when money was cheap, or even throughout the 2010s when there was this whole sustainability kick, people were paying more for like sustainable clothes or something. But then after COVID, once money got really expensive and everything happened with the economy, green premiums kind of weren't a thing anymore. So you're saying that there is a place for a green premium just in this
Yes.
situation?
I think it is not universal across the shipping industry.
But it's happening.
It's happening, and it's happening from...
That is cool.
Yeah, we see it from European-based shippers. So, I mean, the way that Europe doubles down on their commitments and their targets is unlike the US. And so we've seen that sustainability is not included in an RFP or included as a requirement just for compliance. It is part of their long-term strategy as a company. And because of that, they're actually willing to, in some cases, co-invest in newer equipment like EVs, or just generally pay a higher rate or award a higher volume of freight.
So is this the electrification thing, the level that it's happening at? Is it happening fleet-wide? Is it happening per vehicle or something? Or
it is happening across, I would say, very small. Well, typically equipment, a portion of the fleet is replaced every year. Let's just say best practice would be 25% of the fleet is replaced once a year. So over the course of 4 years, there should never be a vehicle that's older than 4 years old.
Cool.
That doesn't happen, but in theory. And so where we've seen electrification is typically first as a pilot, like procuring one vehicle, one EV to replace an older asset. It depends totally on the route of that vehicle. Long haul probably doesn't make sense versus like a drayage fleet that's going port to final destination. And then if there is success there, we see like smaller numbers of EVs being incorporated, 3, 5, 7. There's one fleet who makes it their entire competitive differentiation. That's Einride. They're European-based, really killer company.
Shout out.
Yeah, shout out to Einride. But yeah, for right now, I would say adoption is slow, and it should be slow until there's the infrastructure to support it.
Okay. So then moving into this idea of data clarity. So I have written down here a few pieces of data that go into this this narrative of profitability and things is fuel emissions reporting, things like this, like driver experience, idle time. These are just some things that you've thrown around. I don't know how they all.
Yeah. So through the lens of profitability, the most important thing to recognize is that fuel consumption and emissions generated from burning that fuel are directly proportional to one another. There's a one-to-one relationship. And so if you, for example, can reduce your idling, which any trucking company would try and do to the best of their ability because that's an expense, an unnecessary expense, fuel waste through idling, you're also reducing your emissions a proportional amount. And so idling is one category where we can see emissions reduction, better route optimization because you're burning less fuel, less left turns, reduces fuel consumption and therefore emissions. And so any action that the fleet takes, whether that's an operational change, a driver behavior, an equipment upgrade, maintenance, anything that improves or boosts the efficiency of the vehicle or reduces the fuel being consumed through better behavior is a sustainable action. They're one to one.
And these are all areas that Greener collects and aggregates.
Yeah, we provide data on all of those categories. I would say one of the most important things for us is historically, sustainability data is not actionable. It is created for a report. It is created retroactively, and the time to act shows up at the end of the year in an annual report. And so what we try to do is focus on low latency data. So our data updates every 2 hours. You can take an action before the end of the day if something doesn't look right. We try to focus on accuracy, net new accuracy, which is why primary data is it's our Super Bowl. That's what the company is founded on, because machine source, machine grade data doesn't lie. Neither does fuel transaction data. And then if there is a case of any outlier value, we can clean it, and there's a quality control process. But if I'm a fleet manager, I want to have full trust in the integrity of the data so that when I take an action, I know that it was backed up by something that was true.
So an analogy that you used that I thought was cool, because as the millions of people watching this know, I love growth, go to market, sales, we're talking to people. And in that world, people use CRMs to
Yeah.
handle management, finance. They have like things like ERP. So is there, it's just when you're talking about aggregating all this data in this world, I feel like you can't be an aggregator without having an ability to present it as well, or even, have a way to find insights for the customer. So like you're saying, sustainability data is often not actionable, but in this case it is. So what is it that fleet managers have where salespeople have CRMs, there's finance and ERP? Is there like a standard in this industry?
There is not a system of record for freight. I think part of the problem is that every fleet runs on different systems through different providers, and there's a lot of siloed data because of it. So for example, a fleet uses one fuel card provider, a telematic provider, could be multiple telematic providers, a dispatch system, an order fulfillment software. And so your ability to log on in a day and understand where you're at, how your vehicles are performing, what drivers need coaching, what orders were fulfilled, basically where to direct your attention is constrained by the fragmentation of these systems. And so one of the most important things that we can do is provide standardization through unifying all of these data points. And then the most important piece of that is we try to think of all of our analytics in a very specific way, which is we need to uncover the trend. We need to discover the cause. So is performance good or bad? If it's good or bad, why? And then if a change needs to happen, can we tie it to an incentive? So if your vehicle is highly inefficient, why is that? Maybe it's that it needs to be maintenance. If you maintenance it, you will then save X number of dollars promotes the action, which is not always the case with sustainable data.
So there's these two terms that I have that I don't know what they are. It's primary emissions and estimated emissions.
Mm-hmm.
What are those two things?
So best practice, holy grail in carbon accounting is that all of your data comes from a primary source. So the great example in transportation is telematics is primary source data because it is coming from a device within the vehicle that you're reporting on. Estimated emissions come from, you can derive emission factors from a various number of sources depending on the level and integrity of the data that you have access to. So for example, at large companies today that don't necessarily have visibility or access to primary data from their suppliers or from their trucking companies, they will use spend-based emission factors. So how much did they spend on transportation? And there's an affiliated or associated emission factor based on the number of dollars spent. It is highly inaccurate compared to source level data, but that's not always the company's fault.
That's standard right now?
It is, I would say, more common than you would probably believe. Yeah.
Okay.
The other way to look at it is self-reported data is really common too, where the company doesn't want to take on the burden of collecting and doing all of these calculations. They'll allow their suppliers to self-report and they'll just take it as, best practice and incorporate it into a report.
How does that usually turn out?
I would say it depends on the rigor of the sustainability department, organization to organization. I think you could assume that unless there is a significant portion of your emissions inventory coming from primary data, that it's highly inaccurate to assume that a fleet operator or a fleet manager who has never heard of Scope 1 emissions is calculating them the right way.
Well, because it just seems that you were just speaking about actions, you were just speaking about incentive. Outside of regulatory pressure, which we can talk about, or we did talk a little bit about the extent of impact that regulation has, is the enforcement of it.
Yes.
So outside of that, the incentive for someone to do a really good and accurate job reporting sustainability data is just if they love the planet.
Yeah.
And
I think too, to your point though, like what is the cost of estimated data? Like if you have bad data, it's expensive because you can't improve what you're not measuring. Which, if we look at this through a shipper perspective, and I have no visibility into what goes on in between point A and point B. Like I contract a carrier, the rate is negotiated based off of a DOE rate table instead of based on true evidence-based performance. I have no idea what the carrier's efficiency is. I have no idea what the average age of their equipment is. I have no idea when they're idling and they're not supposed to. I just know if freight is moved and if it's moved in the time period that we agreed, every single opportunity for better efficiency and consolidation and optimization, I have no control over because I don't have access to the data. And so I think that's when it gets expensive.
So then, okay, so I think an opportunity for there to be incentive is something else that you mentioned at the beginning that I want to go back to, which is RFPs. So what is the role, first of all, what is the role of RFPs in this industry?
So an RFP would essentially, a lot of times they're called bids. So a bid will get released by a shipper, and it is a way of collecting information on carriers that are interested in contracting with that shipper. So the criteria that you and I are talking about, essentially like what equipment are you running, how old are your vehicles, things like that. They can collect generalized information about the company, where do you operate, if it's going to be a dedicated lane, which vehicles are you going to assign to this particular bid, your rate, your history, your performance. And then they're able to include sections outside of just like your standard operations, which is, for example, sustainability or other commitments that you might have to social issues because it matters to that parent company. And so it is a way of collecting as many carriers as they can to select from,
Yeah.
reading the RFP, and then selecting which carriers they want to contract for 12, 24 months.
Yeah. So, you had made a comparison between RFPs and regulation, and RFPs being a form of regulation, formally or informally. So,
Yes.
what does that mean?
So I would say that a carrier is opposed to taking action or investing in something unless their customer requires them to, right? If it's not profitable, if it's not making them more profitable.
Sure.
And so when you start to see sustainability in the absence of regulation, pressure from your customer base is what's going to determine what you do.
Okay. So earlier you had said that as far as, I guess, huge picture, sustainability, taking these actions that you could argue there's a financial motive because sustainability equals profitability.
Yeah.
But you were saying regulation is one way of doing it, but market drivers are a much stronger force in this direction. And so would you say that RFPs are like the regulatory forces in that market driver umbrella that really create this environment for companies to want to take
Yes,
action?
I think your ability to understand if you want to pulse on sustainability in freight, you would read the RFPs that are being released from global shippers to understand how serious they are. And a lot of times it's not just, are you SmartWay certified? Do you calculate your emissions? It is, are you willing to report like on X interval? Can you do it monthly? Can you do it quarterly? What investments are you making in biofuel? Are you open to electrification? Do you operate EVs? And these things matter to shippers. And so I would say the general rule of thumb in freight is what moves the market is what the customer wants, because your revenue is coming from those organizations.
So off of that, there's two notes that I've down, which is evidence-based freight contract. Is that what you just spoke to? Which is we need, because you were talking about, can you report on this frequency? Can you report these things? Is that evidence-based freight contract, or is it something else?
No, it's actually something else. So something that we've seen a lot of traction within shipper organizations is around evidence-based procurement, which means that if you have access to the true performance of every single fleet in your network, you can compare them in a standardized way, two, in a fair way. And so the example I can give you is if fleet A has an average MPG of 8 and fleet B has an average MPG of 5, you would probably want to choose the fleet with a higher MPG because they're more efficient.
Are those made up numbers, or is that real?
Yeah, those are made up.
Okay, good. 5 would be crazy. Okay.
Oh, well, that is standard for the industry.
That is crazy.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And so if you were going to choose carrier A,
Oh my God.
which has 8 miles per gallon, you could essentially lower the rate that you're paying them from, I'm making this up, 18 cents per mile to 15 cents per mile, but award them a higher volume of freight so that it's not like they're losing any profitability.
Sure.
But you're creating a competitive flywheel for your supply chain.
Yeah.
Where you're awarding more efficient carriers, and over time, there's incentive to become more efficient.
Okay, and so there's a lot that we've talked about that you can do when you have this data that we're talking about your supply chain and across your fleet and things like this that you could do, but you're seeing that legitimately you're able to collect data that's accurate from the level of primary source, like we talked about that earlier, and enable people to do all of these things that you're talking about.
Yeah, I can give you 2 really good examples, which would be one of our customers had a requirement from a leading cosmetics company to report their emissions on a quarterly basis, and they had never done that before. And we partnered. We were able to provide the report. They retained a $3.5 million contract. They're a mid-market fleet. It's a lot of money to a mid-market fleet. Very important customer relationship. But after installing Greener, they reduced their fuel spend by 3% the 12 months after, just through taking better quality
Wow.
action. And so for them, it was not even a trade-off, you know? And
Well, I hope they gave you at least half of that.
in another life.
Okay, so then continuing with this shipper carrier narrative. So we have RFPs.
Yep.
And shippers put RFPs out, and then carriers bid on them.
Mm-hmm.
So something that you had spoken about, that I've heard you speak about, is that shippers put performance standards on these RFPs and like scoring metrics that carriers aren't even aware of.
Mm-hmm.
And then also there's a bunch of things to talk about around just the disconnect between these two segments. So
that's something I could talk about all day long.
Good thing we got time.
I know, because you have sustainability departments at a Fortune 500 company. Let's just say it's 5 to 6 people that are trying to drive long-term strategy. And their entire role is based on, can they stay on track towards that long-term goal? And can they unlock capital from finance to fund initiatives that will accelerate their trajectory towards that long-term goal? Then you have procurement, whose KPIs are around procuring the cheapest possible, right? They're trying to drive down the cost that they're spending procuring suppliers, which in this case would be carriers. And so it becomes this race to the bottom where sustainability demands that there's a sustainability section on their RFPs, because they want to be working with sustainability-minded, innovative, forward-thinking fleets that are going to help them stay on track towards that long-term goal. But ultimately, the decision-making process on who gets selected is left with procurement, who only cares about rate. And so you have a disconnect at the top, and then you have a disconnect between shippers and carriers, where there's this unbelievable amount of pressure to invest in sustainable tech, to invest in sustainable equipment, to invest in sustainable fuels. There are hundreds or thousands of fleets that have done that have shared that information in RFPs and lost the bid to a more inefficient, unsustainable carrier because their rate is cheaper. And that's not fair.
Right.
So that is when we talk about evidence-based procurement, bridging the gap between procurement and sustainability, that they are working off the same set of data. And then it does not become a trade-off. And essentially you can reward carriers that have actually made the investment in sustainability.
So are you saying that they lose to more inefficient companies because it's the same coin, because the company that has a higher rate has one because they're being more sustainable?
I think that in any case, procurement will always be a race to the bottom. I would say that if you look at it this way, it is right now more expensive sometimes to invest in newer equipment. It's more expensive sometimes to invest in alternative fuels.
Does the unsustainable fleet have a lower rate because they are not taking the steps to be more sustainable and at the moment are costly?
I think that is true to an extent, where if you are not spending a portion of your budget to just, we'll call it, be more efficient, because that's really what it is, you probably are able to have a lower rate or offer a lower rate as a carrier. Understood. If that makes sense.
Yeah, got it. Okay. So in general, shipper and carrier disconnect. What is this narrative?
I think it is back to incentive. Like, if you think about it in the most simplest of terms, their customers are asking them to invest their own dollars into technology and equipment and behaviors that they're not willing to financially partake in. So it would be like me saying, hey, if you don't procure 10 EVs and spend $3 million doing that, you can't carry for us. But oh, by the way, if you do that, we're not going to increase your rate. So there is this massive of course, disconnect, but frustration where you want to have a good relationship with your customer, but it feels like your customer is beating you over the head with all of these demands and expectations that are financially extraordinarily expensive at times, or even just, I would say, trivial expenses that they're still not willing to pay you for. And so the amount of hoops that a fleet has to jump through just to win a contract that is not significantly more profitable than other contracts is pretty intense, and I would say pretty disappointing sometimes.
So is that I guess is that the major is that the major disconnect between shippers and carriers? Is there also something one when they're working together and the relationship is happening, is there also something that creates friction there? I mean, we just talked about all the data visibility
Yeah.
type of things. So if these two companies have completely separate and I guess I'm just trying to draw like a nice bow around it for me to understand. So when this relationship is happening between a shipper and a carrier, both of them have different relationships to sustainability or reporting or regulation.
Yeah.
That because there's not a high standard of data visibility across that relationship, it seems like a good opportunity for friction.
Yeah.
So where does, first of all, is that true?
It is. I would say that there's this misconception, which makes sense, but from the trucking and logistics industry, that if they share sustainability data with their customer, and it could be that their performance looks poor, that they will be penalized. And that's not true, but that's a fear that makes sense. What shippers are looking for is willingness to share the data regularly, and then proof of progress. They want to see that incrementally every year, if possible, that you're at a minimum maintaining your efficiency, but in a best case scenario that you're having slight efficiency gains because it benefits both of you. The disconnect from my perspective is split in half. It's at the top that sustainability and procurement do not communicate when it comes to procuring the carriers, setting the rates, awarding sustainability
Okay.
does not exist. So the incentive is broken. It
I
is
see.
pressure to invest in sustainable practice without a willingness to pay more for that investment, which is frustrating.
Right. So then where do you sit? Like, where does your company sit? Where does the solution sit in that?
Yeah. So the power of high credibility data, visibility, an easy way to share data, being a third party administrator so that carriers are protected from sharing data that they wouldn't otherwise want their customers to see and vice versa. Basically just levels the playing field where you can understand why you're getting the rate that you are. You can advocate for yourself as a fleet if you have that data to say, hey, I did invest in this and I did improve my performance X% since last year. This is what our new alternative fuel stack. This is our plans for the future.
Insane.
And yeah, and like, no, we're not going to accept that rate. And as a shipper, you're motivated to say, wow, like I can compare you against these other 100 carriers and I can see that like your performance is better. And because of it, I'm going to award you this higher volume
Yeah.
rate.
Well, I mean, I just wrote that down. Sustainability not rewarded
Yeah.
traditionally. So
That's the problem.
that's really powerful. I love that. Okay, regulation. So you had said something which I think is so funny is deregulation is good for trucking.
It is.
Okay, let me rephrase. You're right. Deregulation is good for trucking sustainability.
Yes.
So
yes.
that seems backward to me.
It, well, it's interesting because all of I'm just going to broad stroke quickly share that environmental regulation set by the EPA is a different type of environmental regulation than the one that helps or hurts greener.
Okay.
So, like, for example, you saw this 2009 endangerment finding repeal that came from this administration that basically said that carbon dioxide is not considered a harmful gas, which on a personal level, it's kind of like, what are we doing?
Yeah, right.
Right? It's like that's a public health hazard, but that is an engine and emission threshold. Like that impacts the OEM. That doesn't impact like the pressures to disclose your carbon footprint. In the same way that there's EPA engine phase regulations for OEMs, and again, they got repealed, but the OEMs had already like manufactured their cars through 2030, and it's probably going to get put back into place, and so they're just going to double down on what they've already built. But I think that the reason I think deregulation is good for sustainability in trucking and logistics is because there's a ceiling when it comes to regulation. It is a reporting fire drill. It is entirely compliance driven. You're expected to disclose these 300 things. You do it once a year, you're done, you're not rewarded for it. And it is just a time, labor, and financial cost to prepare. When it is deregulated and the pressure is coming from your customer, there's no ceiling.
All right.
There's an
sense.
opportunity to differentiate yourself and an opportunity to essentially be rewarded for it from your customer. Yeah.
Wow. Interesting. That is so crazy for me to try to make sense of, because there is just in climate tech, clean tech, whatever word you want to, I like climate tech, but whatever word you want to use for this space, there's some, and deep tech in general, you have to use regulation to like create a market and subsidize the companies that are building it until the cost structure allows companies to exist.
Cost parity.
So the relationship between regulation and climate tech in my head has always been, yeah, you can overregulate. It can create some public perception that may not be helpful in general, but like very tangibly, there's a lot of climate tech that's driven by, or at least accelerated by regulation. So it's really interesting to hear that in this particular case, because of it's not that like, oh, we're deregulated, we can do whatever we want. It's more so like the drivers for this industry, this hard to abate industry, to become more sustainable, if more of it comes from the market than regulation, then we're better off.
They're 100 times over always going to be more responsive to the market than regulation.
Yeah.
Always. And I think also what you just described is very true in the sense that when climate is intensely deregulated, it's not that the vertical collapses, it's the way that you talk about the technology within climate tech that changes, and it is better, cheaper, faster, more efficient. It's not, if you don't do this, you're going to get a penalty or a fine, comply or die. And that was where Greener started.
Yeah.
And it does not work. It doesn't work for trucking. It probably doesn't work for any industry.
Okay, so quickly, because I do want to cover these notes I have about where you guys are going and what this means. So, last two things about regulation. First thing is when there's regulation that applies to a company that's in Europe, or I guess, well, no, this is Europe specific. So if a company is headquartered there or they operate there or whatever, and then they operate here also, and this is, and federally, there's not the same regulation. How does a company deal with that?
Yeah. So Europe has been a core accelerant of sustainability strategy globally, even for US headquartered companies, because very similar to when you see state level regulation that's very broad in scope, Europe is also very broad in scope, where I could be a US headquartered company, but if I have a subsidiary that operates in Europe that does over $150 million in annual revenue, I have to disclose my entire carbon footprint, including my US supply chain operations. And so whether a single policy exists in the United States at a federal or a state level suddenly becomes irrelevant, because I'm doing the same type of reporting fire drill and having to maintain my strategy and my commitments because I'm subject to European regulation.
Wow.
And so I think a lot of times that's why you see the Fortune 500, maybe they're not publicizing that they're sticking with their sustainability commitments because it's not advantageous in this market, but nothing has changed about their process because they know that they're a global company.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really interesting. And so, and then something else that you had mentioned that I don't understand is regulation and capital cycles are different.
Yes. So the best way that I can describe this is, well, two ways. When the policy is overturned and it impacts equipment, so like emission testing for engines is repealed. The threshold that the EPA sets for what an engine is allowed to emit is then either taken away or it's increased. The cycles that equipment are produced on and purchased on are much longer than the regulatory cycle of 4 years if a new administration comes in and overturns things. And so you could just generally think of it going like this, right? It's like every 4 years it goes back and forth, probably not to the extreme that it is in today's current market or with this administration. But because of that, it is extremely, I would say, advantageous for the OEMs and for the fleets to not assume that this will always be something that's deregulated. And I think that's when, in a similar way, when you see companies that double down on, they're just going to stick with their guns in case this comes back into effect, it's more sustainable for the business to actually assume that this will again become regulated. And so that is, I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, so you're saying that from a business perspective, businesses have to in this industry with capital cycles that are much longer than regulatory cycles.
Yeah.
They still have to find a way to comply to regulation, but in reality, given the structure of their business, it's hard to like map exactly.
It's really hard to know what is going to go on.
It complies.
Yeah, and I think like if we take this 2009 endangerment repeal for example, or we take the EPA removing the phases of stricter emission standards for the engines, the primary OEMs that would be producing the engines that just got deregulated have already produced them to that standard like years in advance of when they're going to become commercially available.
Right.
So for them to remove the process of what it took to get those engines up to standard or to make their technology less efficient is more expensive than just complying.
Okay. All right. So lastly, on this regulatory thing, I just wanted to know, we mentioned CSRD, Europe.
Yeah.
SB 253, California. What is Scope 3 disclosure? Investor-driven Scope 3 disclosure.
Scope 3 in general means any emissions that are produced upstream or downstream of the reporting company.
Okay.
There are 15 categories, and
Wow.
2 of those 15 categories are upstream emissions associated with transportation and distribution, downstream emissions associated with transportation and distribution. It's like very complex nomenclature for the supply chain. So the supply chain falls under Scope 3. And because of these regulations and because of shareholder pressure, because of investor consumer pressure, large brands, large organizations and companies have to disclose Scope 3, which includes the supply chain. And that's where the lack of visibility becomes a constraint.
So we talked a lot about past contexts for me, so that I can know what we're talking about. Talked about present day, but what's the regulatory environment looking like, in the next 6, 12, 18 months? Like how is this going to impact companies in the future?
I think near term, you can expect that SB 253 filings are due August of 2026 this year, so in 2 months, and that will be in effect. It is considered a grace period where the rigor and the assurance and the standards at which you disclose, there's more flexibility in how what you disclose is being evaluated compared to what is planned for 27, 28, 29, 30, and into the future. It's supposed to phase in with intensity. And then I would expect that CSRD stays the course. You will have pushback from companies as always, but I think unlike the US, you can always anticipate that Europe as a whole will continue to require some level of disclosure. As far as other things to expect, there's a few states that have put in place copycat regulations to California's SB 253.
Wow.
Very broad scope, private or public companies that make over X number of millions or billions
Wow.
of dollars that do business in state.
So, do you know, like, are we able to talk about which states those are at the
It's
moment?
New York, Washington, and I believe Oregon, but that might not be right.
Wow.
Yeah.
Good for them. I
I
love
know.
that.
Yeah.
All right. So this has been insane for me. This has been a fire hose of information. It's been a whole college course on shipping, carrying, trucking, procurement, regulation, data management, all of the stuff that we talked about.
Good.
And it's amazing that like the intensity I think that you absorb all this information with, like being in the industry, talking to your customers, having the success that you have. So what is the big picture narrative here? Like whether we're talking about sustainability or not, what I'm gathering from our conversation and this one is something I actually wrote down, which is it's about clarity of data across the board, just being able to manage your business better. I mean, is that something you'd agree with, that that's a big picture theme for greener, or what is it that you guys are doing outside of just helping the planet?
Yeah, I think it's exactly what you said, where the most impactful actions can only be made when, like, I guess the best way to say it is the quality of data impacts the quality of your decisions. When you don't have any data at all, you can't take an action. And so, trying to provide data that never existed before to the people that have the ability to make a change that is impactful, is ultimately what we're trying to do, and to create infrastructure so that fleets are rewarded for their sustainable and efficient performance.
Yes. That should be on a sticker. I think that's great.
Yeah.
So before we cut, is there anything off the top of your head, given this conversation, else that you wanted to speak on? Anything I could just write down, then I could just ask you and you could ramble about it?
I don't think so. I feel like we covered everything.
Yeah, you covered a lot.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was like perfect.
All right, then are you sure? Just last chance, just to get again, we could even cut it. I don't know about any of this information.
No, I feel really good about everything that we talked about. I'm excited.
All right, great. So in the end, thank you for coming back. Thank you for being a part of the growth. It's been unbelievable to see how much success you've had in the last 7-8 months. I'm so excited for the next 7 to 8 months, and to see where you go. So thank you for running through this, and I look forward to the next one.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.